The Story of Alexander Graham Bell. Hello, my name is Zari Malik, and today I'm going to be talking about the 1939 film, The Story of Alexander Graham Bell. So, you may know about Alexander Graham Bell, inventor of the telephone. He was also someone who wanted to build a telegraph originally. Then he went on to invent telephones, and then he further went on to build a practical powered aeroplane. But yes, he is most known for inventing the telephone. And aside from this basic knowledge, though, we're going to go into a slightly deeper dive of his life and his viewpoints and stuff like that. And so Alexander Graham Bell was born on March 3rd, 1847, and he was 29 when he finally received the patent for his invention of the telephone. And it took him a few years, and though the movie really showcases his love with his wife Mabel to be his main motivation for creating the telephone and really going through with it and stuff like that, though that is a very large part of it, their love was not as happy and as pure as the movie made it seem, and his intentions and everything he really thought about deaf people going into everything was not as just easy to see and stuff like that. So we can get back to that later, but for now, a brief look into his history shows us how he got into studying what he did. So before his invention and working on his inventions full-time, he used to be a teacher for the deaf. He used to work with children and use visible speech through these written symbols to help children imitate sounds. So he got this passion from his father, who taught elocution to the deaf. And for those who don't know, elocution is a skill of clear and expressive speech, especially of distinct pronunciation and articulation. Anyways, Alexander Graham Bell, who I will now refer to as AGB, just to save myself from the mouthful, eventually marries Mabel Hubbard, one of his deaf students, when she was 19, and he was 29, less than a month away from when he was the age of 30. And I think it's also important to note that he was born of a hearing father and an almost deaf mother. His mother was mostly deaf, and he really saw how she got along with his father, and he saw how she was able to really speak for herself and articulate herself and her beliefs properly. And same with Mabel, that was one of the things he really loved about her. He loved the way that she was able to speak, and she mainly identified as hearing rather than deaf, which is really interesting. But yeah, there's just a lot going on in Alexander Graham Bell's life, and there was a lot that just really contributed to how his life was shaped into the way it was. Anyways, so the movie, The Story of Alexander Graham Bell, was released in 1939. It was both the story of how AGB came to create the telephone and the riveting and passionate love story between him and Mabel Hubbard. So AGB at the start of the movie is still experimenting with sound waves and working with children using things like a glove with printed letters on it, and it was this big thing, and he would press on certain parts of the glove, and the child would associate those certain parts with different letters, and they would be able to piece together words and simple sentences and phrases, and then through that they would be able to communicate, or they'd be able to point, maybe make certain sounds in order to give affirmatives or negatives and stuff like that. And eventually the large miracle of the movie is that the little boy is able to say father, and the little boy in question is on the right. He's that little boy being hugged by the actor for Alexander, and on the left, the lady there is supposed to be the actor for Mabel Hubbard. And anyways, so at this point, he's making his own version of the telegraph, and he meets an investor who would like to give him money for his inventions, for the telegraph, not yet the telephone, as long as he worked with his daughter, Mabel Hubbard, Alexander Graham Bell's future wife. And so Mabel was about 15 when she met him, and the age gap definitely more normal back then. Yeah. And so the movie paints AGB to be this great and always hopeful pioneer, incredibly charismatic and earnest, and incredibly respectful to the deaf with whom he worked with, because they inspired him. And a quote from the movie was something along the lines of, "Through Mabel's deafness, the world would hear." And it was this entire thing of how Mabel and just the deaf community itself was just a large motivator for him to really work with the telegraph, then the telephone, and just work with sound and stuff in general. And while we know that this lovely story, when referring to the movie, has a happy ending, since we know the telephone is a thing and that he does in fact marry Mabel Hubbard, the movie is titled The Story of Alexander Graham Bell, but it leaves out very important chunks of his life. So to those who know people in the deaf community, are a part of the deaf community, know about deaf history, or those who maybe took an American Sign Language class, they may see this as common knowledge, but for many it isn't. He's remembered by many with rage because AGB argued for a complete ban on sign language. And he viewed the world as a hearing world, and believed that deaf people really needed to acclimate to it, and he believed that like the deaf really wanted this too. He believed that deaf people really just were not happy ever. They just were very unsatisfied with their lives, and that everything would be so much better if they would just start talking and get used to like speaking and understanding how people spoke and stuff like that. And you know, he really did want the best for everybody. He did go into this with good intentions. It was incredibly ableist and dehumanizing, and the ways he went about it were completely wrong. Um, just horrible, actually. But he was biased against it because his mother and his wife were both hearing for a while before they lost their hearing, so they were more suited to his beliefs, and like they showed like the smartness and the wit and like the general understanding of what somebody was saying, even if they were going deaf or were deaf. And because of this, AGB believed that like every single deaf person should stop signing and learn instead how to liberate and speak, and that they should solely rely on that rather than using sign language like at all ever. But he's forgetting that like both his mother and his wife, they were hearing during the critical learning period for language, and like they were able to like understand certain sounds, understand certain meanings, be able to pick up on how to properly articulate themselves. But many deaf people, those who were born deaf, just did not ever have that. They were behind, and so because of that, there were a lot of issues with deaf education for a while. So back then, the deaf were called the deaf and dumb, and Alexander had like truly believed that. In fact, he was a large supporter of eugenics and believed that deaf people should not procreate, especially not with each other, because they would be doing the world a disservice by creating more deaf people. And he truly wanted the eradication of deafness and deaf culture. And so while some may be thinking it's hypocritical because he does have a deaf wife, many are forgetting that she lost her hearing at the age of 5 due to the scarlet fever, something that did cause a lot of deafness in people. And so, yeah, that's how she lost her hearing. So she was able to hear, and that's why she was able to properly identify with like hearing more so than deafness and stuff like that. So there were just a lot of things going into it, but yeah. And so, in September of 1880, there was this International Congress on Education of the Deaf in Milan, Italy, and there were 164 delegates in attendance, but there was only one deaf man in attendance whose name was James Dennison, and he was a Kendall School principal. And ultimately, they ruled that the pure oral method ought to be preferred, and only 6 people opposed to that ruling. So ultimately, Alexander Graham Bell's proposition that sign language be banned passed. So due to AGB and his beliefs, children would be belted and their hands would be tied if they were found signing. They no longer had as many like variety in their classes, and more time was spent on learning how to like properly make sounds and properly speak and lip read, rather than like basic subjects like math, reading, history, etc. And many deaf children were practically illiterate as they could mimic sounds and read, but ultimately they didn't understand what they were actually reading. They only knew how to like make the sounds of what was written on the page. And the union of deaf marriages itself was also limited, and just in society, many people believed that deaf were only useful if they could speak and understand lip reading. And ultimately, he did irreversible damage to generations of deaf families. And there's a short film that came out in 2012 titled Confession, and it's a dramatized version of the effects and the events following the Milan Conference, and how Mabel struggled with her identity as both deaf and a someone born hearing, especially because she was married to AGB. And the conflict is actually quite realistic, as she wrote to him in 1895, "Your mute deaf business is hardly human to you." And as she died, she confessed to her daughter Lise that, "Having taught you all my life to forget that I was deaf, I now want you to remember it." And they truly did love each other, as seen through their love letters, something even shown in the movie, The Story of Alexander Graham Bell, as like the great proof that showed HGB didn't steal the idea of the telephone, as he wrote a love letter to her on the like back of a paper of his original like rough draft for like what he needed for the telephone and stuff like that. Um, and so ultimately they did love each other, but it just was not as healthy or as great as the movie really portrayed it to be. And just even Alexander Graham Bell himself, he had good intentions and wanted to create the miracle of like the deaf becoming hearing and for deafness to be solved. But ultimately, he did more harm than good, and he dehumanized so many people in the process of it. And, there was just irreversible damage to just the deaf people in the ways that they were perceived by society, the ways that they perceive themselves. There was a lot of ableism, both internalized and externalized. It was just a lot. He ultimately, hurt so many people. And so, overall, the story of Alexander Graham Bell was romantic and entertaining, but it was woefully inaccurate to the true horrors and the hate that AGB created and continued. And it also just doesn't cover anything about his past, really. It doesn't talk about his parents at all. It talks a lot about the mechanics of the telephone, which were pretty accurate, and it was definitely simplified because, it's a movie and they don't want to bore everybody who's watching it. But ultimately, it really just avoided a lot of what he did. And so, though the movie shows him to be charismatic and passionate, it just completely erases any bad things he's ever done. It erases any depth he's had as, he's only shown as like really passionate and loving, and it was not accurate. And yes, the movie is romanticized, dramatized, and only focuses on the good aspects of his life, and not like his true hateful story. And so I'm not quite sure if the movie title is even fitting, as it's the story of him, sure, but it's not the full story, and therefore it doesn't truly encapsulate him and everything he's done. So, yeah, thank you so much for listening to my presentation.